So welcome people to study number 4, in which we're focusing on the Transfiguration, but we'll be looking at a couple of other parts of the gospel as well. And as you may be aware, the gospel reading for this coming Sunday is the story of the what's traditionally known as the Transfiguration. And in our lectionary, that happens on the last Sunday in Epiphany, because the week after, on Wednesday, we start on Ash Wednesday into the period of Lent.
Acknowledge the first peoples of the nations where we are all based, and we acknowledge them as the custodians of that country and where we're meeting today. And we have a prayer for studying the Gospel of Luke to get you in the right frame of mind. So, loving God, whose Son Jesus Christ was wonderfully transfigured before chosen witnesses upon the holy mountain, and spoke of the exodus he would accomplish at Jerusalem. Give us strength so to hear his voice and bear his cross, that we may see him as he truly is.
Yes.
Amen.
Amen.
So we will actually start by thinking about this phrase, my beloved Son, and how it appears in baptism, transfiguration, and crucifixion, and then we'll go on to focus on transfiguration. We've been thinking about how we approach Luke's gospel, some of the key themes of the gospel, and comparing Luke's account with Mark's account. Here I want to compare Mark's overall structure with Luke's overall structure. And one way of getting into this, on the left is my summary of Mark's gospel. If you want to speed read it, you just have to read those 13 or 14 lines, and that's the whole story of the gospel. You'll see that chapters 1 to 9 are skipped over in one line, so it's not a very detailed summary. But I've emphasized three parts in that story: the baptism, the transfiguration, and the crucifixion. When Jesus is baptized, Mark says that the voice comes from heaven and says to him, "You are my Son, the beloved, with you I am well pleased." When Jesus is transfigured in chapter 9, the voice again comes out of the clouds and says, "This is my Son, the beloved, listen to him." And then for a third time at the crucifixion of Jesus, the very last scene before Jesus dies, the centurion watching him on the cross says, echoing the words of the baptism and the transfiguration, "This man was God's Son." So some interpreters of Mark's gospel have highlighted the fact that at the beginning, at this what looks like a pivotal moment in the middle, the transfiguration, and at the end, the affirmation is made that Jesus is the Son of God. And that's in fact what's in the title, in the very first verse of the gospel. When we look at Luke's outline, this is my even slimmer outline of Luke's gospel, done in terms of geography. We can see that where Jesus is baptized in chapter 3, we get that same word from God: "You are my Son, the beloved, with you I am well pleased." And at the transfiguration, the voice from the cloud again says, "This is my Son, my chosen, listen to him." At the cross, interestingly, and perhaps we'll look at this when we come to look at the whole passion narrative. We'll look at this again in the passion narrative of Luke. But at the cross, the centurion, rather than saying this is God's Son, says this man was innocent. The Greek word there is dikaios, which can mean righteous or just, and it can also mean innocent of any crime. So an interesting little change that's happening there. So the key moments in Mark and Luke alongside each other like this. I think I've noted in the notes that in Luke's account, when Jesus is before the Sanhedrin, they actually say to him, "Are you then the Son of God?" And he says, "Well, you say that I am." So there is a place in Luke's gospel, not the crucifixion, but the trial before the Sanhedrin, where that theme is noted. Now, you should have in your notes that have been sent out, and if anyone didn't get the notes, put a note in the chat, and I'll send it to you while you're in the group. But we've got the parallel accounts of Mark of the baptism, transfiguration, and crucifixion. And so our opening exercise is what should be quite familiar to you by now, to look at the two parallel accounts, the Mark and the Luke version, and just comment on the differences that are there between Mark and Luke. And then we'll do about 10 minutes, I think, in the group, because there's 3 passages to look at. Then we'll come back and think a bit about what we have observed and why that might be.
What did you discover about the differences between Mark and Luke? Were there differences?
Yes.
Yes, there were differences.
There were differences?
Yes. In one, he's beloved, and the other one, he's chosen.
Is beloved or chosen? That could be just a translation thing.
Right.
Mark goes through and says, God's son, my son, God's son. So the son of God thing is important, whereas Luke has 3 different descriptors, God, the beloved, the chosen, the innocent one.
Yes.
The thing that I know particularly is that in the Luke version, Moses and Elijah talk with him about his departure, which he's about to accomplish in Jerusalem, which is not in the Mark.
So we've got an additional clause by Luke there, explaining what he's about to do that is missing in Mark. Yep.
Apart from the fact we've got a variation between a day 6 and day 8.
So there's a temporal difference.
And we also talked about how in Luke, his appearance, his face changed to where his clothes, or he was transformed before them.
Yes, that's a good spot, because that's a significant difference. He's transfigured in Mark in the translation I've got, where the appearance of his face changed.
Yes.
It's the translation in Luke, which is reasonably, I think, close to what the Greek is. They're different words that Mark and Luke are using, and they do have different meanings, even though they are related in some ways.
And it's important for the readings on Sunday, because the Old Testament reading is Moses' face being so radiant that he had to put a veil over it.
Yes. Yes, there's certainly a mosaic influence, I think, on these particular verses in Mark and Luke. But you might say Luke has dumbed it down a bit, or he has made it less spectacular, perhaps.
And that's quite evident in Mark 15, where we get the saying, oh, Jesus, my God, whereas Luke has really not, he hasn't covered any of that.
No. Matthew is the only gospel writer that follows Mark with what's called the cry of abandonment. My God, why have you forsaken me? Luke and John both have different things that Jesus says. With John, it is finished. And of course, in Luke, into your hands I commend my spirit. So it's a more polished ending, if you like, than the cry of abandonment, which leaves Jesus there before, especially in Mark, before the resurrection, literally hanging, without that resolution that something's been finished or fulfilled in a positive way.
The last one we're having a discussion about, Elizabeth, was truly this man in Marcus, truly this man was God's son, whereas Luke said, you got the centurion.
This man was innocent.
Innocent, and we're actually sort of saying, so what was the centurion referring to?
Well, that's a good question, and probably piles of trees have been demolished to write books on that very issue. So yes, what does it mean that is the centurion being sarcastic in Mark? Yeah, sure, this was God's son. Look at him dying with this cry of abandonment. It's a possibility. Is the centurion recognizing a greater truth that seems to have slipped past everyone else at that moment?
Well, it hasn't slipped past everyone else, because in Mark's account of the trial before Pilate, Pilate says, I can't see that he's done anything wrong. And he wants to dismiss him, but because of the crowd, they choose Jesus. They choose Barabbas.
Barabbas,
so
yeah.
Pilate says, all right, I'll send him away. In Matthew's gospel, there's the famous scene about the washing of hands. I wash my hands in the blood.
Yes.
But Pilate never says that he's God's son.
No, he doesn't. But in Luke, 3 times, not just once, but 3 times in that scene, Pilate says this man is innocent, using the same word that the centurion uses at the cross. So Luke has strengthened his apologetic about the Roman governor believing that Jesus was innocent, but feeling pressured by the crowd, which historically is a bit of a big ask. It's probably highly unlikely that the crowd would have. Pilate had all these soldiers there. He could have just started rounding up people.
That's right.
But so it's got this strong theme. This is an innocent man. He's strengthened that. It's there in Mark, but it's really strengthened. And to have the centurion then say it at the cross instead of the expected, this is the Son of God, underlines that even more.
Depending on how you want to translate, as I said, how you see, because some people claim the centurion is being sarcastic.
Can't see the point of that, Elizabeth. It seems out of context.
It depends on how you look at it. If you see a man dying and saying, "Why have you abandoned me?" and you follow that up with a sarcastic observation, "Yeah, sure, you're the Son of God," it fits that context. It just all depends on how you want to colour that particular scene.
So it's the Mark that's the sarcasm, not the Luke.
Yes.
Yes, you didn't make that
Yeah.
clear.
Yeah,
You're reading
sorry.
an awful lot in-
Well, scholars argue it, Bill. I'm just reporting it.
Scholars argue many things.
They do.
All right, we're going to think about some particular elements then in these stories. The heaven was opened at the baptism. The appearance of his face changed at the Transfiguration. The curtain of the temple was torn in two. In fact, in Mark's account of the baptism, the heaven is ripped open, is torn open, just as the curtain of the temple is torn in two in the crucifixion scene. So we're going to think about the symbolism of heaven being torn open, the curtain of the temple being torn open, the appearance of his face changing. As I think Elizabeth's already hinted at or mentioned, Mark and Matthew call what happens to Jesus is that metamorph there, from which we get our word metamorphosis. So there's a metamorphosis, which is often translated as transfiguration, but we can also translate it as transformation. Jesus' appearance transforms, and curiously, Elijah and Moses appear. We'll look at that in a little bit. So what is the impact, do you think, of that kind of symbolism, and how might that relate to metanoia? You talk about metanoia, Elizabeth.
Metanoia, as Tuggeranong people should know, means transformation in your life. John the Baptist talks, it's translated as repent in our Bibles, where when he's doing his baptism thing, he's saying in the translation, you must repent. What he's actually saying in the Greek is you must metanoia, which means to turn your life around. And the idea is that you're completely transforming it. So whatever unsightly or sinful kind of practices you're currently doing, you'll drop those sort of things and you will live a life that is worthy of God and worthy of being a follower of God and being named as a child of God. So it's something quite profound, and it's about the character, and it's about how you actually live out that obedience as a follower of God. Did you want me to go on to metamorphosis?
Yeah, if you want to.
Or do you want to talk about that?
Yes.
But, well, the question is, how might metamorphosis, the change in the appearance of Jesus, relate to metanoia, the change in the lives of people as disciples?
Yeah.
And there's a couple of Old Testament Hebrew scripture passages that are in the material there for you to look at, also to think about this symbolism of being torn apart and things changing. So we go back into groups for 5 minutes.
To talk about that, okay. Yep. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. How did you go with thinking of metamorphosis as it relates to metanoia?
We didn't do that at all.
I'm glad you're so obedient, Kayleen. What did you do then?
We actually talked about whether or not God wanted Jesus to die.
Right.
Sorry.
Just a bit off track.
Just a bit.
know how we got there.
Very
But it was an
interesting,
interesting conversation.
I'm sure it was. And the answer was?
Yes.
Yes.
There were different opinions, and we
There were
listened.
different opinions about what that might actually have meant.
Right, fair enough. Did anyone actually talk about the question?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I'm just trying to dredge an old memory, and I don't know whether it's valid or not, that on the temple curtain was embroidered an angel, supposedly the one that separated Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. Is that right?
I actually do not know the answer to that question, Patricia. I have not heard that before. That doesn't mean it may not be correct. I would have to go into Leviticus or one of those books and have a look at the 300 odd laws pertaining to the temple and see if there was a directive in there to do such a thing.
Okay.
So I'm not sure about that.
So Leviticus for the answer.
Probably, because Leviticus has got a lot of laws pertaining to the priests and practice and how to make the Ark of the Covenant and how to hang the curtains and what should be embroidered on them. It can all be found in Leviticus.
Actually, Second Chronicles 3 says he made 2 cherub angels to put in the most holy place. Workers covered the cherub angels with gold.
That's for the Ark.
Yeah, that's the
Ark itself.
Yeah, no, they're reaching across, yeah. So they're not actually, it doesn't say that they're embroidered on the...
There's a lot about embroidering pomegranates and things like that on the robes of priests in Leviticus. That's where I'm thinking if it lives anywhere, that's where it'll live.
But it could also be something that came from the rabbinic contemplations of what ought and ought not to be done. And it could be that at that stage that was true of the curtain, even though it's not specifically in scripture, because the rabbis have a lot to answer for.
They do. Generally, they don't tend to add things to the temple that weren't there, would be my general impression, Judy, but it's not impossible.
Regardless of whether that's true or not, the symbolism of the temple curtain being torn is what the curtain separated people except for the chief priest from the Holy of Holies.
Yes.
And so the symbolism is that no longer are we separated from God.
Yes. Well, that's pretty much it. So whether it had an angel on it or not, I think is really a moot point, because the greatest symbolism would trump that. The idea that it's an opening up and access to God is available not just to the high priest once a year, but to everyone.
And once you've seen the heavens open to you, you can't unsee it.
Yes. No, that's right. That's quite right.
But we were actually looking at how, the dove coming down, virtually things were ascending down, virtually from above to the people below, so to speak. So it's opening up the way for all to receive. And then we had a bit of discussion about Moses and Elijah, talking about how Moses was up on the mountain, came down. But we did actually have a bit of discussion about there's no place we weren't aware of where Moses was buried or something. We're looking at the significance. Why did we have Moses and Elijah in it? And what was the significance of that?
Well, Moses is the great lawgiver. He is like the hero of Judaism, and he rescues the people in the story of the Exodus. That's why he's there.
Yeah.
And Elijah, of course, is considered one of the greatest of prophets. So in a sense, it symbolises Jesus kind of has them both rolled into one. He's both reinterpreting the law, and also he's like a new Moses, particularly in Matthew. But also he's a great prophet as well.
Just to go back to Patricia's comment, I've put in the chat Exodus 26, which does talk about the screen for the entrance of the tent being embroidered, but doesn't say anything about angels. Yeah.
But that's not the temple, John.
Yeah, that's not the temple curtain.
It's under the heading the curtain.
Yes, but it's not in the temple. It's in a tabernacle tenty thing.
I thought the other thing about Moses and Elijah was that there's no
Okay, I'm just, how?
And there's no burial place for Jesus. I mean, we have an empty tomb.
Well, you do have he is buried. He just gets out of it, Piers. I mean, it's not, that tomb is offered by Joseph and he doesn't stay in it.
Interesting to me in that 2 Corinthians 3 passage where Moses had the law written on tablets, but now it's the Spirit of the living God writing not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. And at the end of that chapter, all of us with unveiled faces see the glory of God as through a mirror, are being transformed from one degree of glory to the other, for this comes from the Spirit. And it's the Spirit that descended on Jesus at baptism. And there's something big going on here around the...
What was that passage again? 2 Corinthians?
Chapter 3.
And of course, that's been borrowed from Jeremiah, because Jeremiah is the first one that talks about the law being written on the hearts of people, not on stone. So Paul is adapting that and reinterpreting that particular point where it's not about, you know, things written in stone, but Jeremiah also talks about circumcising on the heart. So it's come from that.
And that passage also uses the Greek metamorphumtha from metamorphosis, the same as is used in Matthew and Mark for the Transfiguration, but not in Luke. But Paul is using it here to say what happens to us with unveiled faces. We're being metamorphosed.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting here is that the relationship between light and the transformative experience. So
yes.
Light comes down. Light seems to be related to these transformative experiences, and you speak about that, Elizabeth, in your talk about thin places.
Yeah.
And Patricia mentioned an experience she had at a Megalong Valley, I think, where light shone through a cloud and it gave her an experience. So they do tend to be connected in some ways.
Yeah, light is a very potent symbol. Yeah, that's right.
And there's this very strong getting rid of the barrier thing that we don't, I mean, at this stage, the people still believed that the earth was flat and there was a big bowl that was the barrier, and then there was the barrier in the Holy of Holies, and it's a very much more concrete. This thing is breaking open this thing that has stopped us from accessing God, and it changes radically the way we understand our world and the way we understand ourselves and the way we understand our relationship with God.
Well, it should.
Well, yeah, I mean that's the
change it radically.
And we don't get that, I don't think, because we haven't had that barrier stuff there.
That's probably true, Judy. It's like the image of baptism. If I ask all of you, tell me how you describe a baptism, I'm guessing most of you will describe to me an infant baptism. And you'll probably say, oh, cute baby, held by a sister or something. And not everyone will have this, but this is probably the majority experience. And, water being poured on, and isn't it nice? We look at the baby and when we never see the baptismal family ever again. And that's the sort of typical experience of baptism in the uniting church, where what's being described here is actually much more violent than that. When you think of the heavens being ripped open, think of your house being struck like lightning, as ours was some months ago, or a couple of months ago now, and lightning struck the tree at the front. And I can tell you, it is not peaceful, and it's loud, and it's disruptive, and it's very frightening. So, the image that we have imbibed about our baptisms comes from watching infant baptisms. And we think of sweet children and innocence, and isn't that cute, and water being sprinkled, where what is being described here is a chaotic, very in-your-face, violent kind of experience.
So it's like lightning, you're suggesting? The tearing
I am suggesting that.
Yes. I find that very helpful, because the word heaven is quite a difficult word now in our cosmology.
Yes.
But to liken it to lightning, that makes some sense to me.
So, you know, something goes whomp and, you know, breaks open and pulls apart and hits, and it's chaotic and bright, and it's really, you can't miss it. It's really in your face. It's not peaceful or calming. It's something that should disturb you deeply. And it leads to this metamorphosis, which is a complete transformation. This is caterpillar to butterfly stuff. This isn't just deciding, well, I won't, you know, I won't have that extra glass of red wine and I won't insult my neighbour anymore, or whatever it is you feel you need to be, you know, feel bad about. It's a complete transformation of you, not just transformation as metanoia in changing things, but you hatch differently.
How did that come about linguistically, Elizabeth? Like, I would have thought metamorphosis is a change of light from the, like, phosis would be light, wouldn't it? And somehow
Light.
become a change. Yeah. It's a change of thing, which is different.
Yes, it is different.
How has that occurred?
That's a good question, because it can only really be, none of us are going to hatch into a literal butterfly. So, you know, it's not a literal thing. It's really, it's pushing, I guess, metanoia to its absolute limits, in terms of you so change yourself, you become unrecognizable to those around you, in that you've suddenly become just and good and practicing certain things and doing certain things in this context. Because in Greek, in Attic Greek, there's actually a book called The Metamorphoses, and I can't remember now who wrote it, but I studied it in my classics degree. And it's all about these changes, and all of these changes are actually literal changes that are kind of magical, you know, prophets turning into snakes and people turning into turtles and gods changing people into asses and stuff like that. They really did change, but they learnt profound lessons out of those changes as they went through them. And they're probably symbolic in a sense. This literary work he wrote was symbolic in a sense, talking about how it's like looking, let's say, take St. Francis. St. Francis is a rich young man with a lot of wealth at his disposal that he just carelessly fritters away, having a good time. Then he has an epiphany, gives it all away, and goes into this vows of poverty and chastity and forms these monasteries of other like-minded people who wander around the countryside doing good things and telling animals not to eat people. And, you know, it's just such a radical change of lifestyle that he's become a different person. It's that sort of thing.
So the Metamorphoses was by Apuleius, and it tells the story of Odysseus, who dabbles in magic and gets turned into a donkey.
Yeah, so
bring it down to earth a little bit.
So does metamorphosis relate more to the physical world and metanoia to the mental world?
Probably. But you can see a metamorphosis as being symbolic. So you can tell a story about him being turned into a donkey, but it's got a deeper moral kind of meaning about what he learns when he's been a donkey, and how he emerges at the other end of it, a different person who's, you know, seeing the world in different ways.
Yeah.
John, where it says you are being transformed,
yes,
in 2 Corinthians 3:18,
yep,
is that the metamorphosis word?
yes,
Because
it is.
that one's from one degree of glory to
another degree of glory. Yeah,
yeah,
sort of like incremental, ongoing transformation.
Which would be right. I mean, that's coming down to something like sanctification, isn't it?
Yes, that's not a bad way of putting it, David. I mean, if you look at the Catholic process of how they make a saint, that would give you some ideas of symbolically how that works in stages. You know, you've got someone who's beatified, and then before they're deified, and there's other incremental steps between each of those things that have to be met before the next one happens. So you could use that as a kind of template, whether you believe in saints or not. It gives you an idea of what that might look like.
Paul talks about justification and sanctification and puts those two rich theological ideas together, and it's as if justification is God justifying you, but sanctification is the whole work of deepening, developing, entering more into what God wants us to be.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering whether it hadn't occurred to me before, but the Transfiguration at this particular time that it happened, would that be a preparation for what Jesus was going to go through, but also changing him in such a way, like it, because it's the metamorphosis type thing, clearly something happened to him that was profound, like that liminal space that you talked about.
Absolutely.
Was there something that kind of moved him into that new place, ready for what was going to happen?
So I think in Mark and Matthew, yeah, you could make that argument.
He had to come to terms with his own death. I mean, his own experience and thoughts during this transfiguration would have been extraordinary.
Bearing in mind this word isn't used in Luke, but certainly in Mark and Matthew, I think you could make a case for that, Sandy, that it is transforming him in a profound way that allows him to move forward in what he knows his journey is.
Yeah.
Luke's a bit different because he doesn't use that word.
But you could add to that the idea that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, immediately before the Transfiguration, it's the first time that Jesus says that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. So that's Luke 9:21, and the Transfiguration is Luke 9:28. And the same, it happens at the same, it's the end of chapter 8 in Matthew, and then the Transfiguration is the beginning of chapter 9. So now, whether it's dawning on Jesus or whether the evangelists are shaping the story so that an awareness of what is to come is put into the story, that's the moment of realization. The Transfiguration is a change that prepares Jesus for what is to come.
Yeah.
And then we'll look at this in a later session. In Matthew and Mark, fairly soon after that, he decides to go to Judea, down south to Judea, to Jerusalem, and he does. In Luke, he decides to go to Jerusalem, but it's only chapter 9 in Luke. Remember, there's 24 chapters. He doesn't get to Jerusalem in chapter 19. So from chapter ended 9 through to the middle of 19, Jesus is on the way towards Jerusalem. So he's had this transformative moment, but Luke takes 10 chapters to work out, to help us understand what it means for Jesus and for those who are following him along the way, because he calls them to follow him on that way. So, you know, there's all kinds of symbolism that you can put around this symbolic story, I think, in that regard. Now, do you want to go on to thin places, Elizabeth, although we've touched on thin places a lot?
We have touched on thin places. What you've got in your handout that John sent out is an extract from an essay that I wrote for one of my master's degrees about transformation and how it wrote. And just to tell you the experience briefly, John and I were travelling around the UK when we lived there. And we were up on the Pennine Mountains, having seen a sign to a waterfall, and I'm rather partial to a good waterfall. So we went up these really steep mountains. We're in a tiny Fiat. We're in second gear by the top. It was so steep. And when we got to the top, something really strange happened to me. I saw the Pennines spread out in front of me, and I did a couple of things simultaneously. I burst into tears, and I felt that I'd shot down roots into the ground from my body, that they'd actually gone down into the earth there, and I was rooted there. And John said, "What's wrong with you?" Because I'm sitting there gibbering away. And I said, "I just think I've come home." And it was this really strong part that I was on my country. This was my land and I had come home. And, you know, it was a very profound experience. Some of you will know that John and I are sad, tragic family historians. It was over a year later that I discovered that the Rains had their stronghold, and that was my ancestral line in the High Pennines. I did not know that at the time. I did not find that out till much later, that that's where the Rain family actually came from. So it was a very strong experience for me. And I was quite ecstatic when I found out about 18 months later that indeed that is where my family belonged. And I managed to trace them back to the 1500s to a particular parish and church there. So the degree I was doing was about transformation. It was about transformation of communities and self and other things like that. It was in social ecology. So I wrote about it. And that's what you've got in front of you. And I read a lot about thin places at that time because I felt my experience would qualify for such a thing. About thin places where something opens and you have a doorway into some other place, whether it's heaven or whether it's like me, it was into this insight that I'd come home, that this was my ancestral land that I was on. And you can read that for yourself, that these in-between places, it's described by the Celts, it's described by a lot of people who travel, about people who go out into wild places in nature. They say that something alters in their perspective and they get a glimpse into another place. This is quite a biblical notion as well. We have quite a number of places that are thin places where God appears or angels appear or there's an epiphany. The baptism of Jesus could be described as a thin place where the heavens open. Jacob's ladder is a thin place. Again, the heavens open and Jacob sees angels coming up and down. And there are places in the Bible that mediate between the divine and the earthly or the mundane, and between people and godly, either God or godly beings such as angels. And these thin places in the Bible are usually in the wilderness as a rule. They don't tend to occur in built up areas, as it were. And nobody ever emerges from these encounters unchanged. Often there things happen, like Jacob was eventually renamed, and you have people emerging from it often with a calling or a mission or something they're going to do. So they're not only places that open up a glimpse of something other than the earthly realm, if you like. They also open up the possibility of transformation or of metamorphosis, you know, where things alter. And as a result of that experience, the character in the Bible is never the same again. And I've given you a number of examples in that little extract that you've got there. The Celts are quite big on thin places. If you want to read more about it, there's a lot of Celtic literature that you can find about what a thin place is. You generally can't plan for a thin place. You can't decide you're going to go and visit one. They just happen to you. They're the sort of things that you're doing something and you're minding your own business and you go somewhere and suddenly everything around you seems to change. And this transformation takes place. And I made the case in my essay about communities actually need thin places because they give us a spiritual connectedness with earth and community, and they give us also a sense of the divine. So we've got some more questions for you to think about. Have you ever had an experience of a thin place, and what happened to you during that experience? And there's another question at the bottom there after Mark. I don't know if you want to tackle that now.
Well, we've been talking about that already, about
Yeah.
literal and symbolic here, but we can head there.
And what you might look at that as well. How do you understand metamorphosis to look like? Is it symbolic or literal? So, how did you go with those questions?
Interesting.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Anyone would like to share something of this interestingness?
Is that really a word?
No, probably not, but it works. You understood what I meant.
I really appreciated you raising this idea of the thin place, Elizabeth, because when I first went to England, I felt I'd come home and I broke into tears as we drove through the countryside. It's amazing. I think quite a lot of Australians with that sort of Anglo-Celtic background have had experiences like that.
And Americans and Canadians as well. It's a very well documented phenomena, and it's quite well researched, interestingly enough. And, you know, trying to explain what might explain it, which is difficult, I think.
Yeah.
Patricia, did you want to say something?
Oh, I think it was Bill's description of it. It's a place where the awareness of God is very intense. And I thought that was very meaningful.
Well, there's an interest in philosophy around the idea that in the Paleolithic, we human beings participated in the cosmos a lot more directly. and it's as if that was a period of thin veil, if you like.
That's a good point, I think, that you raised, because we've divorced ourselves more and more from nature and ecology and connectedness and wild places and cosmic things as we have become more civilized, whatever that means, as we shut ourselves away and buy stuff in supermarkets and not actually be part of growing and hunting and other things that those folk were engaged in. We don't read our way by landmarks that are natural or by stars anymore. We don't follow song lines. We don't understand the terrain we're looking at necessarily. There's all sorts of things that we've lost from those eras that have changed the way we interact with the world.
It's interesting, actually, that Halloween is traditionally a thin place.
Yes.
Where the two worlds connect, and yet it's often projected as something scary, whereas these other thin places are things that are deeply affirming, where God comes close and does good things.
Yeah. And All Hallows Eve was never meant to be a bad thing. It got transformed somewhere commercially and got associated with devils and demons and witches.
Yeah.
But that was never its original thinking, I don't think. It was the Night of the Dead. It was the night before All Saints' Day that the dead could actually connect with the world of the flesh again. And that may or may not be a bad thing, depending on which dead thing was connecting with what person, I suppose. But scary stories grew out of that, and that's how it became what it is today.
I think for us, our little group, it seemed that there were times of this connection, certainly in the cut, like sort of Hawker in South Australia, and Mary said another place, or someone said another place. But even in church and music, there's that awareness breaking through. It may not be like, well, certainly isn't like the Transfiguration and those sorts of things, but it's more gentle than that. But it does have a profound effect. And one story was the whole church was sobbing. They just had this presence, this connection with heaven.
Well, that's a really good story, Sandy. Because it's nice to know that those moments happen in our churches, because I fear that mostly they don't. And it would be good to see more of them where people did feel they were in the presence of God and that had somehow transformed them in our church buildings.
I think we talked about in our group that some people felt that we get to these thin places in a non-urban setting, like in the mountains or in the hills or something like that, rather than, so we've, in a sense, our mind has pushed us away from our more normal setting into these remote places, like you felt when you had your thin place experience. Whereas maybe it is something we can have in our own home, like in moments of contemplation or prayer. Or Millen spoke about it in a communion setting. It's a place where we can sort of feel that, connectedness.
I don't think there's any rules around this, Bill. I think that, praying in contemplation, I don't see why that couldn't lead to a thin kind of face experience or the feeling of the presence of God very close to you. I think it's a very idiosyncratic thing. There seems to be some similarities as people report these experiences, but they're never the same, if you understand what I mean. They occur in different places in different ways, and people experience them differently and respond to them differently. And that's very heartening, I think. There's not a rule book that we've got to get out and tick a few boxes to say, all right, I was transformed by God today because I ticked 6 boxes. It's not like that at all.
No, that would be the opposite.
Exactly. So it's an individual thing in many ways, or it's something that a communal group may experience in a certain place.
I remember 30 years or so ago when I used to read sociology and anthropology. I think it's Victor Turner and liminal places.
Yep.
And it's a secular concept, but or at least Turner uses it in a secular way, but about in-between places and transition. And it's a long time since I've read it, but it's interesting that the concept isn't just a religious concept. It's actually been used in secular analysis about society as well, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Matt.
Yeah, and Turner's work is picked up by sociologists by kind of sociological reading of the biblical text. This is a liminal moment at the Transfiguration. It's also been picked up in by the Auburn Institute and in the Foundations of Transitional Ministry, the intentional interim ministry stuff that is used within the Uniting Church about churches being in a liminal moment, particularly after they've had a minister for a long time, and then there's a gap, and being constructive and being active in that gap period, that liminal moment before moving on into the next. The limen, of course, is the threshold on the door. We put our foots onto the limen when we walk into the house or into someone else's house. So it's a very simple idea of the threshold. You step over the threshold from the outside into the house, and you're in a new space.
And in ecology, it's the study of that area at the edges of watercourses that's sometimes underwater and sometimes isn't.
Yeah.
So
I think how we interpret the thin space is very important and significant.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that will be different for each person that experiences such a thing will respond to it in their own way and be moved or not moved by it in their own way, I think.
The last thing for us to do on Luke's account of this liminal moment for Jesus is, and some of this has already been mentioned, is to think about the appearance of Moses and Elijah along with Jesus, and also the fact that in Luke's account, he explicitly adds what Moses and Elijah were doing. They appeared in glory and they were speaking of his, now this word is translated in the most English Bibles as his departure, which he was to accomplish at Jerusalem. But the Greek word is exodon, which you should recognize because it's the title of the second book in the Bible, Exodus. And it refers to that key moment in the story of the people of Israel about leaving Egypt, slavery in Egypt, through the Red Sea, that liminal moment of the Red Sea crossing, into the wilderness, which again is an extended liminal moment of 40 years allegedly, and then into the entry into the land. So Israel has a story of Exodus. Luke is here applying that term to the transfiguration of Jesus, where Moses and Elijah are speaking to him about that. Maybe just 5 minutes in groups, Elizabeth, to look at that cluster of questions about Moses, Elijah, Deuteronomy 18, Malachi 4, and Exodus.
Hello. In your whole 5 minutes, does anyone have something to share from that? Hopefully you might have at least got why Moses and Elijah are the two preferred figures from the Old Testament that are standing with Jesus, and got a sense of why that is so.
We wondered how they knew it was Moses and Elijah.
I don't think you're meant to ask questions like that. You just know them because of their Moses and Elijah-ness.
Yeah, well, that's a good
question. I think the whole passage implies there's just this really strong sense that they know who that is. They just know.
Mainly because who else would there be in this moment?
Well, that's true, I think, because you want these two great foundational figures, Moses, giver of the Torah and, purveyor of freedom, and Elijah, one of the greatest prophets that's recognised as such.
Although they could have chosen Miriam and Deborah.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
Sure, John.
Now that's another session, that is.
They could have, but
we
it's
saw more
very
the-
unlikely.
I guess we saw more the relatedness of Moses in terms of Exodus than Elijah. Like that seemed to be a little bit like maybe there's something you can tell us why Elijah was the significant figure.
Well, Moses.
I know why, because he went up to heaven in a chariot of fire, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, he's the only prophet to be taken up before his death into heaven. So that says he's the most significant prophet we have in the Old Testament.
So
What about Enoch?
The Deuteronomy passage says that that there will be prophets like Moses. And the key thing about Moses is, I will put my words in the mouth of the prophet who shall speak to them everything I command. And the role of the prophet is not to foresee the future, but to tell the people here and now what they are to do in the light of God's revelation, in the light of the covenant of God. So the role of the prophet is always to recall the people to that covenant, to speak the word of the Lord to them. But Elijah, who went up into heaven in that dramatic scene, according to Malachi, the last book of the Hebrew scriptures in our ordering of it, he will return on the great and terrible day of the Lord. He will come to turn the hearts of parents to their children and the hearts of children to their parents, so that I will not come and strike the land with a curse. So Malachi says, remember the teaching of my servant Moses, the statutes and ordinances, the covenant, and the person. So that's what Moses gave. So Elijah is going to come to round it out at the end by reminding people of that and turning the hearts of people back to one another in community to live in covenant. And that avoids the judgment of the Lord that is coming. So Jesus is presented by Luke as a prophet. Chapter 7 of Luke, when he raises the widow, the son, the dead son of the widow in Nain, and he raises that child, the people cry out, a great prophet has come into our midst. Luke clearly presents Jesus in the line of the prophets, in the line of Moses, but he also comes seeking repentance. The good news of the gospel is of repentance, is of turning, is of metanoia. And so Jesus actually carries out the Moses and Elijah functions of Hebrew scriptures. In fact, I once assessed a PhD thesis that was arguing that Luke was preferencing the Elijah tradition over the Moses tradition. It's not the Exodus tradition, it's the Elijah repentance coming in fire.
Oh, thanks for that, John. That was really good.
Yeah, so I think there's various elements, symbolic elements in the figures. Yeah. So we've reached time. Moses and Elijah and Jesus and Peter and James and John at the bottom of the picture there.
Yeah.
3 and 3. Don't forget, the letters to Luke are appearing on my blog every couple of days. We're up to letter 4 thus far. You can read them on An Informed Faith. The material that's at the end of your session this week, I'd prepared this and sent it out, and then we decided that the baptism stuff really should go next week. So that's your homework to read, but that will be the starting point of next week's study. We'll look at the baptism, and then we'll look at the temptation, or as I prefer to call it, the testing of Jesus, because that is the passage that's on Sunday week in the lectionary. So we're jumping around backwards and forwards, but we're going back now to chapters 3 and 4, the baptism and testing of Jesus. That's next week.